We're live, Jack.
Welcome to the chat, New Bedford Life's video interview program that takes a deep dive into the issues of the day and the people behind them. Tonight, my special guest is Josh Amaral, the new director of the City of New Bedford's Office of Housing and Community Development. As the HC&D director, Josh is at the heart of the city's new plan to address the suddenly urgent housing crisis in the City of New Bedford. As the former assistant director of the nonprofit PACE, Josh has the experience in the topic. He created the program's Expanded Housing Opportunity Center that led to PACE's efforts to address housing needs during the pandemic. Welcome, Josh.
Hey, Jack. Thanks for having me.
So Josh, you recently, the mayor recently unveiled the city's plan for the housing crisis, Building New Bedford. It's a very comprehensive plan. But before we get to that, I want to ask you what you yourself see as the housing situation in New Bedford. What's going on out there?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So I think what we see in New Bedford is a symptom of a larger problem across the country, across the state, and certainly in our region, where demand for housing has outstripped the supply. Across the country, the United States is short about 4 million housing units, and Massachusetts is short about 100,000 housing units. So when we talk about the issues in New Bedford around affordability of rental units, the affordability of homes for those who want to purchase homes, I think what we're really talking about is a supply and demand problem. So I liken it to a game of musical chairs. If you have a lot of chairs and you have very few players, the game is relatively easy. But if you have few chairs and a lot of people who need to sit down when the music stops, suddenly it's very, very competitive. And so New Bedford residents who've gotten accustomed over time to paying $800 or $900 a month, it's long been one of the cheapest places to live in the Commonwealth. Suddenly, $200 or $300 or $400 or $500 rent increase, which still leaves New Bedford relatively affordable compared to many other cities and towns in Massachusetts. But that really stretches the household budgets of a lot of people. So without folks having the ability to compete for other units because demand is just so high for them, it's like the game of musical chairs. The music has stopped and a lot of people are left standing. So we see it that way, and we've formulated a plan to try to respond to that problem. If the issue is we don't have enough housing units, there's more demand than supply, then the best way to tackle that problem is to increase supply. So, we said this is sort of a kitchen sink approach. Let's throw everything we can at trying to produce more housing units. And you see the same response statewide. You've heard it from Governor Healy. You heard it from Governor Baker before that. At the federal level, you hear it from President Biden, HUD officials, and everyone else. And so we're sort of following that lead, but doing it in a very New Bedford-centric way and in a way that makes sense for us and our residents.
So is it fair to say you see it as a market-based problem, and you guys are going to take a market-based solution to it?
Yeah, I think there's no other way to tackle the problem than to engage, all the stakeholders that could solve the problem. Frankly, city government certainly is not in the business of itself developing housing, certainly not any kind of scale. We know that there are nonprofit developers and organizations like that, and part of our plan is to work with them because that's just the reality of the market. We need to bring those partners on. But by and large, if we want to produce hundreds and hundreds of new housing units, it's going to take private developers doing that. And New Bedford has a unique context where developing in New Bedford is difficult because the construction costs here are similar to that of those in Greater Boston. But New Bedford's rents, even though they may be stretching affordability or becoming unaffordable for too many residents, they're still, half to a third of what they are in Boston. So if you're a developer and it costs you $20 million to build a multifamily development, you may be able to make much more money on that investment in another place. So we have to really hustle and figure out how to make it worthwhile for those developers to do business here, or else we'll be kind of left out in the cold. We won't produce the units that we need, and largely for the last few years, that's been the problem. So it would have been nice to have been developing more units right along, but as the construction industry really focused on the Greater Boston area where they went through this boom, New Bedford was left behind and produced relatively few units.
So that's the market-based approach. For those who are interested in another approach, more of a government intrusion approach, intrusion is probably a pejorative word, a government role. For tonight, we have the city council, as we speak, are getting set to vote on whether to override Mayor Mitchell's veto of a ballot question on whether the city should adopt a rent stabilization program. They're calling it rent stabilization because they're introducing features that are different than the traditional rent control features. They have a percentage increase that they would guarantee to the owners, and some exceptions for new development and mom and pop owned development. But both yourself and the mayor have opposed this rent stabilization question. To talk about why that is so.
Yeah, so the administration has taken a position on this that rent stabilization. We certainly understand the intent behind it, right? And Shane Burgo, Councilor Burgo, is a good friend of mine, very effective on housing issues, and have appreciated really the attention that he's brought to this really important topic. He has, I think, in a way that's unique to the city council, has brought a focus to housing issues. And so, as someone really trying to tackle this problem, I'm appreciative of that. We do disagree on this rent stabilization being the right approach at the right time. I do think that there are people maybe in the Boston area where they've proposed it under very different market conditions where you could make a stronger argument for it. However, here, um, like I said, if our goal is to produce more units, the history of rent stabilization and rent control programs has been that the fixing of the price of the units has really turned developers off to the prospect of developing. Now, the city doesn't want to do business or encourage developers that have any intentions of renting units that are outside of the boundaries of affordability for people. We certainly don't condone landlords or developers that want to gouge and jack up the rents on people overnight, or even over a longer period of time. We want to see stable, manageable increases that our residents can afford, certainly. However, a big part of our plan is cutting the red tape and making it easier to develop and removing barriers so that developers know that they can get their projects off the ground here, that they will be profitable enough for them to exist, to come to be. And we feel that at this point, rent stabilization would send the wrong message to those developers. Being that New Bedford still has among the lowest rents in the state, and being that we already struggle, frankly, to attract the kinds of developers, the kind of development that we need to tackle this problem fully, it's just one more thing. And so I would like to see us really, really, commit to the plan that we have before us now, which I think is a quality plan. A lot of city councilors have expressed their support for it, and I really look forward to working with them because it will take all of us. It will take collaboration, and I know the mayor certainly feels the same way, and we're looking forward to exploring that further with them. And I think we should see how that works first.
Do you have any idea how this vote might go tonight?
I don't. We'll watch it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they're voting tonight or if it'll be at the next meeting. I don't know if it has to be read into the record first, but we'll
I
certainly track it in the conversation, and we'll engage counselors to hear their concerns. I think for a long time before I was in this role, I was in the nonprofit sector working on housing, as you pointed out, Jack, and advocacy and drawing attention to these important issues. Voicing the needs of residents is really important, and so knowing that this plan has been underway for quite some time by the administration, has been a priority and a focus over the last several months. It was in the works prior to the rent stabilization initiative at the council, and now that we've unveiled a plan that I think is really sufficient to tackling the problem, I don't know if that'll have any impact on the conversation, but I think it does show that we are not ignoring the problem and do have some solutions in store.
So your plan, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, is mainly based on encouraging further development of housing, as you mentioned. If the uh, council does override either tonight or in a few weeks, is there will you have to adjust your plan, given that there'll be a whole discussion all year long on rent stabilization in the city?
I don't know that it would require adjustment necessarily. I think we'd press on with the plan as is, but
I just mentioned that the mayor had mentioned that there has been an effect on certain housing developments already that have been talked about in the city because of the talk of rent stabilization.
yeah, we've heard that. I mean, anecdotally, I've talked to a lot of developers, and it's not just the specter of rent stabilization, although that is one factor that has been discussed, but I think it's all of the different things. So some of the things we talk about in the plan, removing regulatory barriers, making it easier for projects to get permitting, with fewer parking restrictions, with smaller lot size than maybe currently permitted under zoning. Also making sure that developers have a clear pathway through the planning process, through the building and inspectional services process, and can make sure that their developments land. What we've heard anecdotally is that there are barriers throughout some of those processes. Hasn't always been intuitive for developers to come in and get their projects rolling. It's taken time, it takes months, and it takes a lot of money for them to navigate these processes, and that introduces some unpredictability into the process. So if your perception as a developer is that New Bedford is already a more difficult place to do business than another similar city, I think the idea that the prices of housing will be controlled by the government and you may have to submit to, rent stabilization boards or additional paperwork, or you may have to navigate other challenges when it comes to managing your tenants and working through those regulations that government may put up for you. We think that would inhibit development, and developers have expressed their concerns about that.
Okay. So the Mitchell administration's Building New Bedford plan is based, as we said, on finding ways to encourage housing development and to get developers who might not be able to afford to develop in New Bedford otherwise to develop here. But that sort of thing takes years. What would you say to renters or even first-time home buyers who are trying to find something affordable now? What is your advice to them?
Yeah, we've tried to factor that into the plan. So we understand that, the construction of even with streamlined permitting and fast tracking these projects, the construction of a large multifamily project takes, anywhere from 2 to 3 years, or longer in some cases. And so we know that those answers are not overnight for folks. In the medium term, we are looking at vacant buildings and making better use of those. So rather than ground up construction, which can be even more costly and even more time intensive, we can get some vacant properties back onto the market sooner. There are a lot of houses in the city, single family homes and otherwise, that are basically turnkey, but are tied up in probate court. Maybe a previous owner passed away and it's owned by relatives out of state. And so we're going to work really hard to get those units turned over and back onto the market sooner. Unfortunately, we know that even that might take too long for, the vast majority of folks that are struggling with this problem. So we propose some shorter term solutions, whether that's rental assistance programs that can help people avoid eviction, that can help them cope if there are rental increases that are too hard to bear. We also want to help homeowners stay in their homes. We realize that that's become more expensive and more difficult for folks. So we have some emergency repair programs that we're rolling out here. So someone may need help with a roof. They may need help with home accessibility upgrades. And the Office of Housing Community Development, that I'm fortunate enough to lead, has long had some of these programs, but using some of the city's federal ARPA resources, we're really going to double down on them, to make them easier to access and to increase the amounts of those funding sources. Lastly, first-time home ownership, we know is extremely important. Some of these programs can also be used on condominiums, which we know there are a good number of those in the city and represent decent starter homes for many people to get into the market and build equity. We want to invest heavily in that, so we have outlined a plan within the plan to increase our first-time homebuyer program and offer up to $40,000 to first-time homebuyers that are eligible for the program, so that we can incentivize them to purchase homes in the city, build equity, and also in the process, we know that owner-occupied properties are generally better kept and generally contribute to the community in very positive ways. So we want to incentivize all that behavior, but we also want to make sure that people's needs are met both in the emergency, near term, while we tackle these longer range solutions.
So I don't have this as on my question list tonight, but it strikes me as you talk that I should offer you an opportunity to maybe take this time right now to outline. I don't want to. I mean, I know that I think 32 or 23 points to the housing plan, so we can't do that in this format. But why don't you take some time to outline maybe 4 or 5 of the most important initiatives that you think that the housing plan includes?
Yeah, appreciate that, Jack. So there
I don't
are
know if that's putting you too much on the spot.
no, that's fine. That's fine. So there There are 22 points in the plan. All 22 have value and add something to the conversation, and I think represent the comprehensiveness of the plan. The fact that we've really brainstormed solutions. These solutions have been suggested to us and have come from a lot of different sources. They fall into six main categories. So one is facilitating new housing production across income levels, and this is where we talk about the developments that are already in the pipeline. There were 150 units that were permitted or are in progress that were funded through the American Rescue Plan Act. Since then, there are about another 100 units that have come on into that pipeline. These are largely cruise developments, old school, the St. Mary's Home building, and so forth. We want to continue that, and that's where we're going to fast track permitting. We're going to make it easier for those developers to get those projects launched and off the ground, because that's where you can take big bites out of the problem. If we we don't have this number right now, but if we knew that we are, say, 2,000 units short, the only way we're really going to catch up is by doing 50 or 60 units at a time in some of these projects throughout the city. Our next bucket is making use of existing housing stock and space. This is where we get into maximizing the use of those vacant properties. The city owns a number of these facilities, whether they're old school buildings, whether they're vacant lots in the city that could be developed into housing. It isn't uncommon for you to drive down a street, Jack, and see like a triple decker, a vacant lot, and then another triple decker. Maybe the house in the middle was demolished or burned down at some point in the last 100 years, and we weren't able to rebuild a house on that lot because the lot is too small. We want to change the zoning so that, if it matches the character of the neighborhood, it matches the other houses on the street, you could construct a house there in that spot. And we'd look to some of our nonprofit partners to do some of those programs so that we're creating affordable units that are whether they're income restricted or they're available without restriction. Our next bucket is promoting home ownership and independent
If
living.
I could just interrupt for just one second,
Please.
because something you said caught my attention.
Yep.
You don't really know exactly how many units we need. Is it possible to find out how many units we need and then come up with a plan that addresses that many units and then identify places and then go out and find the developers? Is that pie in the sky, or?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. And we're there. There are some efforts afoot to really hone in on a number. So we know that it's 4 million nationally, based on a study done by an organization called Up for Growth. So it's 4 million nationally. It's about 100,000 in the state of Massachusetts. So you could further extrapolate their formula to try to figure out our region. And I do want to emphasize region, because New Bedford, being a relatively small city in terms of land mass, that's largely built out on that landmass. We do have to look regionally where there is space to build, and so you're right. I think we will work on that number. We know that it is up there. The 250 that we have in the pipeline is definitely not too much, so we're going to keep moving in that direction. But it would be nice to have that mapped out a little bit more scientifically.
Go back to your points.
Thank you. So promoting home ownership and independent living is when we get into the first-time homebuyer programs, those grant programs that we can work on. We also want to take a look at our regulatory framework. This is some of those zoning changes, whether it's minimum lot size, whether it's parking. There is an ongoing comprehensive plan. It used to be called the master plan, which really is the overarching document. This is managed by our planning office in the city, and they're doing a great job. We're going to look at accessory dwelling units. This has been a trendy solution in a lot of places. We know that because of New Bedford's environment, we may not have thousands of accessory dwelling units, but if we're able to produce, I don't know, say 100 of them, these are units that are basement apartments, attic apartments. Our ordinance right now does not allow for detached ADUs, so like the creation of an outbuilding where someone can live. Often these are used for elderly relatives. Sometimes homeowners might downsize. They live in an accessory unit while their children, the next generation, inherit the main home. Right now, our ordinance in the city does not allow for that. So we want to look at that and come up with a best practice ADU ordinance so that we're doing it in a smart and thoughtful way, but we may be able to chip away at the problem in the margins with some of these solutions. We're also looking at the transit-oriented development zones. So around the train stations, we know that development should be easier to come by because people will want to live within walking or biking distance to the train station. And so we want to maximize the potential of those areas. So the planning office has been working for a long time on the transit-oriented development here in the city, and we look forward to that process concluding in the next few months. And we also want to look at the sale of tax liens, which has been covered by the Light and other media institutions in the city. That's not necessarily a solution to our housing shortage per se, but it is a housing relevant topic that we want to take a look at. That's in that regulatory framework. And then the last two, establishing a regional approach on housing issues. New Bedford just simply can't tackle this problem alone. You've seen across the state an interest in engaging suburbs and surrounding towns of metro areas to be part of the solution. You can't have communities that are entirely made up of single family zoning with very few rental units, very little density, and then force the housing shortage on cities to say, the cities need to solve this problem by building. In some cases, we're out of space. In some cases, the economics don't work. And if there's buildable room in the communities around us, we want to encourage a regional approach to that problem. The state law has changed. They are going to, in essence, compel towns, particularly towns that are bordering MBTA stations, to more proactively build multifamily housing. And so rather than wait for them to come along and do it, New Bedford would like to collaborate. We're going to do our part. We're going to do more than our part, but we do need help from the towns. And then our last is addressing housing instability and homelessness. This is, again, to your point, Jack, earlier, we're not going to be able to tackle all these problems and solve them all overnight. So we do want to budget more for rental assistance. We want to look at the way that our homeless services in the city work and make sure that they're working better than ever, because we want to make sure that we are avoiding homelessness and moving people from the street back into apartments. And we're working with our nonprofits to do just that. So that's the plan in a nutshell, without talking about all 22. That's most
All
of
right.
it.
And I have questions on all sorts of areas of that. But in the
Yep.
meantime, we have a question coming in from one of our viewers, from Isabel. She wants to know if you can define affordable for New Bedford residents, because one of the issues in Boston was that the development was a lot of luxury housing. No one's really building luxury housing in New Bedford, but how are we going to define affordable?
No, I really appreciate that question, because it's difficult, I think, in my field in general to talk about housing, because there's no like agreed upon glossary of terms. So sometimes when we talk about affordable housing, um, we mean housing units that are part of a government program to keep the rents fixed at a certain level, or they restrict the income level of people who can move into those units. But oftentimes, what people hear is affordable, meaning I can afford it on a regular person's salary, right? And so those things get mixed up quite frequently. For the purposes of our plan, we try to avoid using words that are confusing. So we focus mostly on income restricted housing and market rate housing. Income restricted housing would be some of those programs. For example, a household of two making under $45,000 a year, they're the only people eligible to live in this unit, just as an example. So a lot of projects in the city, some 30% of our rental units are in some form or fashion subsidized, or in some form or fashion income restricted, participating in a government program of some kind, and that is high relative to other communities around us. When we talk about market rate, for some people that triggers a connotation to like luxury housing, but that's not true in the way that it's viewed by us or by developers. So market rate in our circumstance just means the price of the unit, the rent, will be fixed by the market. The landlord is going to rent that unit. The property management company is going to rent that unit at whatever the market will bear. So if no one wants to rent a unit at $1,500 a month, they'll have to lower it and find somebody that will rent it at $1,400 a month. We don't necessarily have a threshold when we talk about affordable units. We know that the more units we add to the market, the more choices people will have, the more options renters will have, and that will drive down the cost of housing, just in a simple supply and demand economics 101 sense.
So New Bedford is land poor, not a lot of room to build sprawling garden type apartments that you see in some of the suburbs. Are we going to have to build high rises in the city? Is that what's going to have to happen, like around these MBTA stations or whatever?
It may be, and there are some height restrictions that will come out in the transit-oriented development zones that I mentioned earlier. I don't know that they'll be necessarily high-rise, like 15-floor apartment buildings. I think it's much more likely we'll see 3 or 4 or 5 level buildings in some places. The developments in the downtown are largely of that kind of composition, and I think that's a type of development that works well. Because it's so costly to construct buildings from scratch, from new construction buildings, I think we're going to see much more development in existing buildings, what is called adaptive reuse. So this may be taking an old church building and converting that into housing. This may be, every day I drive by the Kempton School on Shawmut Avenue on my way to work. I look at that site. It's large. There's an old school there that hasn't been used since I think 2015 or so. That building could probably house 15 to 20 apartments, and then you've also got a large parcel of land that could potentially increase, multifamily housing or also feature single family housing to match the neighborhood. So I'm just brainstorming there. There's no proposal necessarily, but we know that the city has an abundance of older buildings that are not used. Within the TOD zone, in that Church Street area, you have the Chamberlain Mill. It's one of the mills in the city that is large enough to certainly be developed as housing, and we've had a lot of success in the previous 2 decades converting mills into housing. So I think we have to start with some of the things that are more within our grasp. Um, the cost to construct a unit from scratch, a new construction unit, is over $500,000 per unit. So you're talking about a 50-unit building, maybe a 5-story new construction building with 10 apartments on each floor at a cost of $25 million today. And those projects are probably 3 or 4 years away. So those costs have only escalated since the start of the pandemic for a variety of reasons. So we have to be realistic. The quickest way to tackle the problem is to take the strong buildings that we have now and try to make them into housing.
So, so there are quite a few schools in factories around town. I have a few of them written down here. The Phillips Avenue, the done by the Kempton. They've all been closed for years. Sometimes they just sit there for years and years until a developer comes along and can find the programs and make the numbers work. How can we make this happen quicker? Because it does seem that it's not really news that these schools or these old factories exist. It's just that they sit there.
Yep. I think clearly articulating the city's priority on developing housing and the types of programs that we're willing to consider, the types of parameters for these projects that we're willing to consider is very helpful to developers. I also think that removing all the regulatory barriers that we can, and to be clear, we want to be responsible stewards of those sites. We want to be respectful to neighborhoods. We don't want to upset the apple cart when we're doing these developments. So, it's important that we have a very thoughtful process. We want to truly honor the historic nature of the city and ensure we're preserving historic buildings. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're not overburdening these projects to the point that they don't work. That developers just simply don't want to do them because they can do their work elsewhere. So some of those issues are what I've heard from developers as reasons why they haven't been able to get some of those projects, or those projects haven't been as attractive to them as we need them to be in order to get those sites developed. But you're right, Jack. We do have quite a few of those buildings. Many of them are municipally owned. So with the assistance of the city council, the administration would like to move some of them along and get them ready for development at some point in time, because I think it represents a much easier pathway to getting units sooner than later.
Can you say something about our zoning and building codes that specifically is inhibiting quick development? Do you know of some specific examples that developers mention that, oh, I really find it hard to New Bedford to develop in New Bedford because the zoning code says this, or the building regulations say that? Can you give me some examples?
Yeah, well, we'll talk about the parking requirements. That's one that comes up in a lot of places and has become a big forward-thinking way to get housing built. But currently, for every apartment that you want to build in the city, you are required to have 2 parking spaces on site. So some of those old school buildings, as you know, don't have the room for, say, if you're going to have 18 apartments, you would need 36 parking spaces. And so you picture the footprint of some of those school buildings. The lots don't necessarily sustain that kind of parking. So then developers say, well, um, we're building one bedroom apartments. This is likely to attract, single people to live in them, whether they're seniors, whether they're recent college graduates just building their life, whatever the demographic may be. They are unlikely to have two cars, or in some circumstances, around train stations and access to public transportation that really works well for people. Some might rely more heavily on public transportation to commute and so forth. So we have to ask ourselves the question: does it make sense for us to have two parking spaces per unit? Could we do one? Could we settle somewhere in the middle? And how can we navigate that? In other cases, the zoning around a school building is not sufficient for multifamily residential use. So cleaning up some of that, getting some of those buildings rezoned proactively is another thing that we can do to make it a little bit easier for people. And then one of the things we propose in the plan is to revive something that the city has done in the past. It's sporadic, but more collaboration in city departments. So ideally, when a developer is kicking off the process, they're going to sit down maybe with myself, the building department, the planning department, the Department of Public Infrastructure, and all the relevant entities at the table, and go through kind of their plan for the site, proactively identify issues that may happen in those developments, work through them together, discuss feasibility, and we think that that would down on time and expense for them, which will in turn cut down on expense for renters. So those things make a real difference, and so we want to do as best we can to make sure people get through those processes.
So, Josh, we're having a little bit of a trouble with your signal coming through, cutting in and out. So I don't know if there's anything on your end that you know that can do to, it's freezing up on occasion. So if there's anything you can do to stop that from happening that you know of, that'll help. I have a question coming in from Keith Grace. He wants to know, is there any way to increase the Section 8 certificates in New Bedford? As we all know, there's a long line of people waiting to get Section 8 certificates, a long line of people waiting to get into the federally and state-run public housing units that we have in the city. But I think it's important to, before you answer this question, to note that Section 8 and government housing developments are not generally understood to be affordable housing. They're low-income housing. Correct me if my distinction is wrong. And my impression is that the city is looking for the suburbs to share in more of that and to build more of affordable and market rate housing. So I'll just let you take it from there.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So right now, the problem in our case is not that there's a lack of vouchers for folks for Section 8. There are a sufficient number of them, we believe. People have issues finding the units to move into. So there was a time where someone would receive a Section 8 voucher, and that was great for them. They were set for a very long time, and their housing was going to be stable and secure. Unfortunately, now someone may be awarded a Section 8 voucher, and they have 90 days to find an apartment, and they can't find one because the units are just not available. They may get an extension for another 90 days. They may still not find an apartment. They may get another extension. They may still not find an apartment. And then, unfortunately, they lose the voucher. It goes to the next person on the list. So it is probably the most stark example of the housing shortage coming back to haunt us as possible, because Section 8 vouchers are in a lot of cases a very important tool for folks that are getting out of homelessness or rebounding from really trying economic circumstances to rebuild their lives. And it's been very difficult to find units with those vouchers, even when the vouchers are available.
Why is it difficult to find those units?
There's a mix of factors. One, there's hardly any vacancies in the city, period. So just because there's a housing shortage, it's harder to compete and find those units. Again, the musical chairs example, there are only a few chairs, and there are a lot of people trying to sit in them. And then
I've heard
secondarily,
that I've heard that some landlords are reluctant to take Section 8
that's another
certificates.
factor. Yeah. So when the rental market is very slow, landlords like Section 8 because it's a guaranteed rental stream, right? Even if a tenant doesn't necessarily pay their portion of the rent, the government portion of the rent will get paid every month on time, like clockwork. When the market is really strong, landlords can often rent units at a higher rate than the government will pay for, which makes it difficult. And even if it's all things are equal, a lot of landlords are resistant to renting to Section 8 tenants because participating in the Section 8 program also entails housing inspections. So the housing authority will come in and inspect those units and will provide feedback. They won't be able to pay the rent if the unit doesn't meet certain standards. So that's an example where even landlords that have good intentions, they take good care of their units. They just don't want to be burdened with the inspection and the red tape that's associated with it, so they opt not to. I should be very clear. Landlords are not allowed to discriminate against voucher holders. So when we hear those circumstances, it is very difficult for us. If you ever see an apartment listing that says, I don't accept Section 8, we should report them to the proper fair housing authorities because it's not allowed to do that. But unfortunately, it is a fairly common practice, even though it's beneath the surface.
I want to push back a little bit, Josh, on the plan's emphasis on bringing the suburbs into building more affordable housing and multi-unit housing. The suburbs, as I understand it, as they grew up after World War II in America, were all about the car and all about single-family houses on large lots. People were seeking to escape the problems of the city. And once they got into the middle class, they felt that the schools were better, that the crime was less, things like that. And so they have forged their identity on the single family homes on large lots. And let's face it, there is a lot of um, uh, attitudes of I don't know how else to describe them as not wanting to be like the city in the suburbs. So what is the motivation for convincing the suburbs to build more uh, multifamily housing, build more affordable housing?
It's a it we make no I want to cast no aspersions that we think it's an easy conversation to have that towns will intuitively um, you know get on board with this. And this is again a statewide conversation, so we emphasize it in our region. We think it's important here in Greater New Bedford as it is anywhere, but it's the same all throughout the state. The Governor Baker passed some reforms that changed the way that zoning boards work in the state, where now projects can be permitted with just a majority of zoning board members as opposed to a supermajority as it were before. Both he and now Governor Healy have embraced this MBTA communities law, which addresses any community that is host to an MBTA rail station, but also the border adjacent communities to those cities, which largely captures almost all of the state. So border communities to MBTA towns are required to have a district of reasonable size in which multifamily housing construction is permitted by right. So developers can propose their projects in those places, and they don't need a ton of local approval to make those projects work. And they've emphasized recently, the Attorney General's office emphasized recently that this is the law. There's no some communities have I think this is unfortunate. Some communities have said things like, can we get rid of our MBTA station to not be subject to this law? Some other communities have said there are some grant funds that you lose if you're not in compliance with the law. They said, well, let the state take the grants. We're okay with that. We're not going to comply with the law. And the Attorney General recently said, you lose the grants, you can't get rid of your MBTA station, but you still have to comply with the law. You're going to end up in court eventually. We haven't seen any of that in our region, to be clear. MBTA Communities Act is not really relevant here yet, and that the station hasn't opened. New Bedford just submitted its plan, and the surrounding towns I don't think have been subject to that quite yet, but it is coming. We know that there are going to be forces outside of our region that are going to be implementing some of this stuff. But I also don't want to lose sight of the question. The ultimate argument for this, Jack, is it's a moral one. It is a moral argument that we are all suffering from a housing crisis. It impacts every one of us. It impacts all of our family members. For many people, it impacts their children who may be graduating from college and want to move back to their hometown but can't find a unit. It impacts seniors who might want to downsize and get out of their homes or free their home up for the next family to come into town, but there's nowhere for them to move in their town. And so it has disproportionately put the burden of housing people in those situations on cities like New Bedford. And all we're saying is towns should be part of the solution. So it's not to say that towns need to be upended. Fairhaven and Dartmouth will not be New Bedford. New Bedford will never be Fairhaven and Dartmouth, and we all have our unique strengths, and we're very proud of all of our communities, right? But where you can, let's figure out a way. So if you have large undeveloped parcels of land that could become multifamily housing in some of the suburbs, let's make it happen. Let's figure out how to do that. And let's collaborate so that we can steer development to where it makes the most sense. There are projects that are proposed in New Bedford that would be better in the towns. I'm sure there are projects that end up in the towns that would be better in New Bedford. So it becomes a matter of regional collaboration and I think writing our own way rather than having outside forces write it for us.
Yeah, well, we've already seen some pushback on that idea in Middleborough, and I am skeptical that the suburbs will at least immediately embrace this. They have fought what is it, the 30B law, where developers come in and they are allowed to have more units if they build affordable housing, and almost all of our suburbs have fought that. I mean, some of the suburbs, Acushnet, Rochester, Mattapoisett, have very low numbers of affordable units
Yeah.
in the cities.
Well, I mean, it's a 50-year-old law at this point regarding the subsidized housing inventory. So 40B, what you're mentioning, is mandates every city and town to have at least 10% of its housing stock set aside as subsidized housing, or for the developments to be subsidized. They don't, every unit doesn't have to be, but the 25% of a development, like Solimar in Dartmouth, for example, has income restricted units and then has units that are not income restricted, but all of those units count for their inventory. New Bedford is the only community in Greater New Bedford that is over 10%, over the 10% threshold. All of the towns are below that. Some of the towns are very well below that. And even more broadly, more than half of New Bedford's housing units are rental units. Over 90% of the housing units in every other place around us are single family homes. So very few rental units are available in the towns. And what we want to see is just more options for people, the ability to move. We don't think that anybody should have to move out of New Bedford because they can't find a single family home. We also don't think anybody should have to move out of the towns because they can't find an apartment there that's affordable to them. And where there's better chances of development, where there's land, where there's market for it, we just think that everybody has to come to the table and be willing to contribute solutions.
So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. We have a question from Susan Lee about question about whether there are state and federal funds available to rehab in old buildings and to build income-related housing. Of course, there is that kind of money, and a lot of it is in your plan. Why don't you talk a little bit about the subsidies that you think will help encourage housing development?
Yeah, there are a lot of great programs. So, one of the ones that I think is critical is the historic tax credit. So this is a big program that's been used to rehabilitate a lot of the mills in the city. Can also come into play when we're talking about some of the old school buildings. There are a few mills that are not developed that would be potentially eligible for historic tax credits. My understanding, those tax credits can be used to offset over 30% of the development cost of a project like that. So in the hypothetical development I mentioned earlier that might cost $25 million, taking 30% off with a program like that is very helpful. We recently have had, we've had some discussions. There's actually a lot of ongoing debate at the State House right now about a program called the Housing Development Incentive Program, or HDIP. This is a program that's set aside specifically for gateway cities, and it is to stimulate development in those places. So understanding all the realities of developing in New Bedford, the fact that construction costs are higher than the rents here can really cover, this is a program that could be helpful in closing those gaps. Historic tax credits and HDIP both do not come with requirements to set aside units on an income restricted basis. Virtually all other housing development programs do come with that, whether it's federal low income housing tax credits, whether it's home investment partnership funds that flow through our office here in the city, federal ARPA dollars that are available right now. All those programs mandate that units are set aside for people making less than 60% of the area median income. 60% of the area median income is great. We need a lot of people to live in houses like that, and our plan embraces developing units that are income restricted. But what we want to see is a mix of units. So there have been a lot of developments in New Bedford over the years that are entirely all income restricted units, and we fear that concentrates poverty in certain buildings, concentrates poverty in certain aspects of the city, certain places. That has ramifications for the economic mobility of the people living in those developments. It also has ramifications for the education system and for a variety of other municipal factors. So it is a best practice in the state, it's best practice across the country to see an income mix at each property. And so while it may be easy for developers to come and say, you know, we want to take advantage of this federal program, it's going to create income restricted housing all over, you know, in one concentrated in one place. We'd like to see that dispersed and moved around. So it really is determining what makes the most sense for each project and stitching together the financing that make those projects work. But um, there are ample funding sources available to people. I had a conversation yesterday. We had a great visit from HUD, Regional Administrator Juana Matias, former state representative in Lawrence. Really, really bright. She was fantastic. She was appointed by President Biden to lead the regional office for HUD, and she and her team came and visited New Bedford yesterday, and they really thought highly of what we're proposing here. They believe fully in mixed income housing, even though they're in the business of income restricted housing at scale. But in the course of doing that, we had a conversation with Steve Beauregard, who's the New Bedford Housing Authority executive director, but also the president of the Development Corporation doing the 117 Union Street project, a really exciting development there. And I think he said that there are 11 different funding sources making that project work. It's a $19 million development. There are 11 different state, federal, private sources of funding going into that building, whether it's home, ARPA.
When is that slated to break ground?
It's supposed to close in the next 6 weeks or so, and hopefully there's a groundbreaking this summer.
People are anxious to get some of these shovels in the ground. Have you guys done an inventory on all the buildings, both in the city's control and uh, underutilized private sector buildings that could be used for housing? Is there anything like that?
It's that work is underway. I mean, you know, of course, the city knows what it owns, and we can do that. I think there's some work to be done to determine which of those should be prioritized for housing development versus other uses. Which of those should be tackled first? Which ones represent the best development opportunities, and which ones are better left for later when we could use our resources in the here and now on other things. Underutilized privately owned properties, I think, um, is a more difficult one. It's hard to tease out sometimes what's going on in some of those properties, but as someone who lives in the city, works in the city, drives around constantly, you can ask anybody. I'm very frequently pulling over to the side of the road and taking down an address and trying to do some research after the fact of what's going on there. And we're really doubling down on that work. There's a great program through Mass Housing, which is a fantastic agency that does this work at a state level, called the Neighborhood Hub. And the city has been a recipient of this grant. We participate in that program. Our office has led that work here, and we've picked a few zones in the city to go parcel by parcel and really examine them on that basis. And I think we're going to expand that work in the coming months as part of the plan. And we're really excited about that because, as I mentioned, the best development opportunities we have are buildings that are standing, that are underutilized, and could see a better future.
So the city council is going to have to approve any kind of zoning changes or changes to the building code regulations. It's no secret that the mayor has had some challenges getting some of his initiatives through the council in the past few years, if not longer. I know you've long worked with the council. Have you reached out yet to any of the councilors to try to build a coalition to pass any of these plans?
Yeah, aside from I'll say the politics of it all, the council and the mayor are largely on the same page when it comes to stimulating housing development here in the city, and so it's been encouraging to have conversations with city councilors in recent weeks, really since the release of our plan, in some cases before the release of our plan, about the things that we could be doing together. I had a conversation just the other day with City Councilor Ryan Pereira, who's the chairman of the Committee on Ordinances. which is where a lot of the regulatory changes would have to go through. And he's of a similar mind. He's someone who understands the nuances of the development world and has understood where there are some issues where projects get bogged down. So I'm looking forward to working with him. Looking forward to working with all the city councilors about that. It is helpful to have really good relationships. I've worked well with the council over the years in my role as a school committee member. I've come to know a lot of them, and I think the issue of housing is too important for us to fall into some of the same old stuff. I think we have to, this is an issue that transcends that, and I know the mayor is absolutely excited to collaborate with the council and make sure that we're tackling this problem for New Bedford residents.
So I have a question from Lisa Ron, wanting to know if the plan addresses the needs of disabled people who are under the age of 60. She feels that that constituency falls between the cracks sometimes in housing developments. Is there anything specifically aimed at disabled people who are not of retirement age?
There's a couple things in the plan. One that comes to mind is the home accessibility program. So this is an expansion of an existing program, but the ability to do home modifications through work with our office and receive financial assistance to make those things go, we find to be very helpful for folks. This is often constructing ramps. This is doing grab bars in bathrooms. This is stair chairs to help people move up the stairs, and we're happy about that. I think more broadly, we know that there's a shortage of housing for people that fall into that category. Every housing development that we take on just about will have accessible units in them by virtue of existing building code. And the more federal dollars or state dollars or local dollars that we infuse into these projects, typically the more requirements there are for ADA accessibility, whether that's elevators, lifts, units that are appropriately sized, right doorways, proper height countertops and things like that. So we toured yesterday the Holy Family Apartments building with representatives from HUD, and the unit that we were fortunate enough to tour through is actually an accessible unit. So you have a building that is, I think, 120 years old or thereabouts, and it's going to be converted where there's some accessibility introduced even into an older historic building.
Hmm. There's a plan for the adjacent rectory, is there not, for housing there too? The
The
Lama St.
well,
Lawrence Rectory?
I don't think there's any. I don't know of any plan there at the moment, but a lot of the churches, I think, are in rectories. The Cruise Development Company has a proposal at the St. Joseph's Rectory up the north end. I couldn't help but stand at the Holy Family High School building yesterday and look across the way at the Holy Family Holy Name Elementary School, which was closed in the last year or so as well. There's no parking there at that site, but it is another large building, and right now any building that fits that criteria is going on my list.
So we recently had the director of a very successful New Jersey homeless program talk to some of the homeless advocates in the city, and she talked about a program called Housing First in addressing homelessness and one-stop shopping in also addressing some of the homeless needs. And I think she had gotten to a point where any person that was falling into homelessness in her county, they could address it immediately. So it's like, I don't know what it was called, net zero or something like that,
Yeah,
but
functional zero.
functional zero. But what about that approach to homelessness? The criticism has been made that we're addressing homelessness at the moment of crisis where people have nowhere to go. These people often have substance abuse or mental health issues, other issues, and it really is a housing problem. If they had housing, then we can work on their other issues. But we're approaching it from the crisis mode rather than the housing first mode. What do you think of that
Yeah.
approach?
Yeah, so there's been a move in recent years in the federal government to embrace this concept of housing first, which is simple and intuitive, and I think makes a lot of sense. This is the idea that no matter what challenges a person may face, often substance abuse or mental health or physical health or any wide range of economic and socioeconomic factors, we believe that the best way to resolve homelessness is to get somebody into housing first. So it is very difficult to recover from substance use while you're on the street. It is much easier to do that if you're safe and stably housed. You have access to case management, you have access to services, which doesn't mean it's a successful trip for everybody that goes through, but we know that that's a model that works. Ms. Orlando came to New Bedford. She was from Bergen County, New Jersey, where they have the Bergen County Health and Human Services Center, which had 90 shelter beds, had a medical component, and a soup kitchen, all in one facility. And they achieved 1 year um, functional zero homelessness among their chronic homeless population and functional zero homelessness in their veteran population. Functional zero does not mean that nobody experiences homelessness. It just means that those who are experiencing homelessness are very quickly um, sheltered or very quickly rehoused, and they move through the system. Now, New Bedford, for the last several years, has been very proud to have functional zero homelessness among our veterans. I think functional zero homelessness in our veterans in New Bedford um, has not been hard to figure out why that's the case. There are a lot of VA vouchers that are available for veterans to avoid homelessness and get stably housed. The Veterans Transition House has a wonderful facility here in the city that involves shelter beds and has some of those wraparound services. They also own some other properties that they use for housing for veterans. So to your point, Jack, the solution to homelessness is housing. The Veterans Transition House and Veterans Affairs Office have been able to combine their resources to make sure that there are enough options for people who fall into homelessness that are veterans. We don't always have the same solutions for people who fall into other categories, and so we need to make that better. We have a great service provider network. One of the things we propose in the plan is to get some outside experts like Ms. Orlando and others to look at our system and see the way that it works and give us feedback. It's largely worked the same way for a long time. Being new in this role, which is part of the administrating entity for our homeless system, I'd like to get an independent analysis of that, and the mayor is interested in doing that as well to make sure that we're doing all we can for our homeless population. The really important takeaway here is that all these steps are linked together. So if someone is experiencing homelessness, maybe they're on the street, maybe they're sleeping in a car, which is all too common these days, unfortunately, they should have ready access to shelter immediately. In too many cases, it's difficult to access the shelter. The shelter is full. Well, why is the shelter full? People should only be staying in shelter for short periods of time, and then they should move to something called permanent supportive housing, which is like your own apartment, but with supportive services and case management to come with it. Um, the reason there are too many people at shelter, they're staying shelter for up to a year, sometimes longer, is because the permanent supportive housing units are also full. Why are those units full? People should be successful in those programs and then moving out to their own stable housing situation that's going to be permanent for them. Maybe they won't have as many case management services. Maybe they may have to pay a little bit more as they gain some economic stability in their lives. But people haven't done that because, again, there are not enough housing units for people to move into. So it clogs up the whole system all the way back to the intake site at shelter as a result of there not being enough housing units on the market. So it really has to be a comprehensive wholesale solution. We're very fortunate to have the Homeless Service Providers Network and the strength of the providers that we have in the city. But we know that one person homeless is one too many, and we have to do everything we can to redouble our efforts. The housing crisis has this impact. It's a ripple effect across everything, and it's another area we can stand to do more.
So we're nearing the end of our hour, Josh, and I think an hour is about the a good amount of time for both those who are participating and for those who are viewing. I think any more than that is a challenge, but I still have 5 or 6 questions at least that I'd like to ask, and I'm sure our viewers have more. So I'm going to have to ask if you'll come back in a few months and check in with us and see how the plan is going. In the meantime, I have one more question, and then I'll let you close however you want. We have these 150 units that the city has said that ARPA, the federal pandemic relief monies, are going to support in the next year or so. But we really know that we probably need thousands of units. So how are we going to scale up? What is the plan to do a scale up? Because that's really what it's about if we're going to address the problem and not just do little things around the edges. How do we scale up?
Yeah, so going back, I wish I could rattle off the number of how many units we think we need in New Bedford, I think we'll have that number in a few months' time. But if we just look at the Massachusetts number, about 100,000 units across the state, let's say that New Bedford should have another 2,500 units or so. Or Greater New Bedford should have another 2,500 units or so. So it becomes a matter of, there's that 150, there's the other 100 or so that are percolating in the pipeline. There are a few single-family subdivisions that are proposed in the city or working their way through. So that's not hundreds of units, that's dozens of units. We have some old school buildings. Let's get those back on the market. That could be a few hundred units. There's a couple mill buildings, I think, that would be prime development opportunities. There was a mill in New Bedford that was fully permitted. It was going to be about 200 units. It has not moved forward. The permitting recently expired, but that's a project we'd like to see get back off the ground. That's up to 200 units. There are a
Which mill
few
is
other
that?
buildings of similar size that
Which mill is the 200 unit mill?
that was the one on West Rodney French Boulevard over near Kilburn Mill.
Okay.
It's owned by a private developer, and we'd like to see that project get moving once again. If you have a couple mills like that, that's 2, 3, 4, 600 units in total. And now I think when you stitch that together with maybe 50, maybe 100 accessory dwelling units that didn't exist before, when you've got some adaptive reuse of churches, old school buildings, it does add up. It does make enough of a difference. I think what's most important is that in the very near term, we're demonstrating to developers that we can show the pathway to get their projects through, and we can deliver on what we say in our plan, which is that we're going to do everything we can to incentivize development, to get development off the ground. And if we do that, I think we're going to see a great momentum once people really internalize the message that New Bedford is open for business. Our residents need housing, and we're committed as a city government to seeing that through.
Okay, we're a couple minutes over. Is there anything you want to say by way of final wrap up, Josh?
Well, I've enjoyed the conversation. As always, Jack, I would steer people to the city website, our Office of Housing and Community Development website. You can read the full plan there. Everything that I talked about today is there in writing. A lot of I'm sure I missed some of the great points and some of the data points that we've got in the plan, but I really encourage you to take a look at it. It is a solid effort and a lot of great work by our team at the Office of Housing and Community Development and other city departments and other stakeholders throughout the city. It was really great to be tasked with participating in this by Mayor Mitchell. I'm glad that housing is a priority of his, and I'm really happy to be working on it. It's been a passion issue for me for quite some time, and there's nothing I'd rather be doing than working on this as part of the administration. So I've enjoyed that. If you think that you are eligible for some of the programs, or you know anyone that would be eligible for the programs, I encourage you to reach out to us and figure out how you can take advantage of them. I mean, first time homebuyer. I mean, some of the repair programs, but also if you're falling behind on your rent, or you may be one of the folks that's living in a very precarious housing situation and need to be connected to some of our resources, please reach out to us. Let us help you navigate those situations and prove that we can deliver on what we say to you as well. So, and lastly, if you are driving around and you see an abandoned building, a building that could be developed for housing, something that you think could be part of the solution to this that we may miss, and there are pockets and neighborhoods where there's a house in the middle of the block that's vacant that we might not know about, please do bring that to the attention of the city. You could let your city councilor know. You could contact me, send it to our office. However you want to get that message to us. There's nothing small enough or too small for us to explore as part of the solution to this problem, and we need everybody's help with that. So
Thanks very much, Josh. There you have it. There's more information on the city's website, the Office of Housing and Community Development. Google it, City of New Bedford. This has been Jack Spillane of the New Bedford Light. This has been The Chat, and my guest has been Josh Amaral.
thanks, Jack.